In the first two videos of this series on why a Baptist minister started keeping the Sabbath, I explained that as a former and ardent Baptist minister, after years of teaching people that you don't have to keep the Sabbath or that any day can be your Sabbath, when I started reading, studying, and praying over scripture diligently with an open heart and mind, it was revealed to me by the set-apart Spirit that I must keep the Sabbath as holy because first, it's Yahweh, our Elohim's commandments, and second, Yeshua observed the Sabbath faithfully. The Messiah says in both the Old and New Testaments that he never changes. Therefore, Elohim could not ordain the Sabbath as the seventh day of the week, only to later change it to the first day. But are there other indications in the New Testament regarding the practice of Sabbath observance by the early churches? Additionally, do any passages shed light on the specific day Paul might have set aside for worship or instruction of Gentile converts? These questions are related to the third reason why a former Baptist minister like me started keeping the Sabbath. New Testament Gentiles kept the Sabbath. Let's start with Acts chapter 13, verse 14 and 15. It states, by passing through from Persia, they came to Antioch in Pisidia and went into the congregation on the Sabbath day and sat down. And after the reading of the Torah and the prophets, the rulers of the congregation sent them, saying, men, brothers, if you have any word of encouragement for the people, speak. And then the story picks up in verses 42 to 44, telling us, and when the Jews went out of the congregation, the nations or Gentiles begged to have these words spoken to them the next Sabbath. And when the meeting of the congregation had broken up, many of the Jews and of the worshiping converts followed Paul and Barnabas, who, speaking to them, were urging them to continue in the favor of Elohim. And on the next Sabbath, almost all the city came together to hear the word of Elohim. The first question I ask myself, and that you must ask yourself, given the potential importance of the instruction here in Acts chapter 13, is, what reasons could there be for Paul to wait for the next Sabbath rather than meeting the following day, which was Sunday? The narrative doesn't mention Paul explicitly informing the Gentiles that Sabbath observance was no longer required. This raises a question. While the text implies continued observance for Jews, why wouldn't Paul, especially in a message about grace, clarify the law's diminished role and explain that the Sabbath wasn't binding for Gentiles in this new era? After the synagogue service ended in Acts chapter 13 and verse 43, both Jews and Gentile followers or proselytes sought out Paul and Barnabas. The apostles then spoke with them, encouraging them to remain connected to Elohim's grace. This raises another question. In this context of new believers, Gentile converts transitioning from a different religious practice and paganism all around them, how were they to continue in Elohim's grace? However, a week passes and the people are eager for more of the word of Elohim. Yet Paul asks them to wait until the next Sabbath. Look at Acts chapter 13, verse 42 through 44 again. It says, and when the Jews went out to the congregation, the nations begged to have these words spoken to them the next Sabbath. Why the next Sabbath? Why did Paul have them wait until the next Sabbath? This could be seen as another missed opportunity to introduce the concept of Sunday worship to the Gentiles. Interestingly, the text then states in verse 44, and on the next Sabbath, almost all the city came together to hear the word of Elohim. The emphasis on the Sabbath meant continuing in the grace of Elohim, which involved observing the Sabbath for those early Gentile converts. As I continue reading and studying scripture for myself with an open heart and mind and not preconceived notions, I read scriptures like Acts chapter 18, verses 1, 4, and 11. Let's look at Acts chapter 18, verses 1, 4, and 11. Acts chapter 18, verse 1 says, and after this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. So here he is, he's going to Corinth. And in verse 4 it says, and he was reasoning in the congregation every Sabbath and won over both Jews and Gentiles. And then verse 11 it says, and he remained a year and 6 months, teaching the word of Elohim among them. This is a profound passage of scripture that we must not overlook and that we must understand and that we want to make sure we read in this proper context. As I initially read the scripture and began to understand the scripture, I would say to myself, I thought the preacher told me we were Gentiles. A year and 6 months equals 78 weekly Sabbaths on which the Bible provides factual evidence that Gentiles gathered on the Sabbath to be taught Yahweh's word. This passage illustrates that even Gentile believers gathered on the Sabbath to learn and worship. If Gentiles worshiped and were taught by Paul on the Sabbath, why aren't we? Furthermore, many argue that Paul taught the Gentiles on the Sabbath to please the Jews. Acts chapter 18 and verse 6 reads, however, when they resisted and blasphemed, he shook his garments and said to them, your blood is upon your head. I am clean. From now on, I shall go to the nations. This verse shows that the Jews became angry, resistant, and blaspheming towards Paul because on the Sabbath he had taught Gentiles and Jews alike that Yeshua is the Messiah. Despite teaching Gentiles only, Paul persisted in teaching them on the Sabbath for 18 months. The claim that these Sabbath meetings were intended to appease the Jews is unconvincing. Following the principle of 6 days of labor, Paul dedicated his weekdays to work, just as the Sabbath commandment instructs. Interestingly, he also taught both Jews and Gentiles on the Sabbath itself. This raises the question, if Sunday observance was already in practice, wouldn't holding regular Sabbath teachings create a conflict? With only 5 weekdays for work, it seems Paul would have been violating the 6 days of labor aspect. And finally, in Acts chapter 17, verses 1 and 2, it states, they came to Thessalonica, and according to his practice, Paul went in unto them and for 3 Sabbaths was reasoning with them from the scriptures. These verses highlight that even in Thessalonica, a Gentile city, by the way, Paul stuck to obedience to the 4th commandment. He spent 3 Sabbath days engaged in discussions about the scriptures with the Gentile people there. Again, I will ask, if Gentiles worship and were taught by Paul on the Sabbath, why aren't we? The early Christian churches' practices regarding Sabbath observance among Gentiles evolved over time. So we must not be deceived by this historical development that's been influenced by religious, pragmatic, societal, and political forces over centuries, because early Gentile believers worshiped on the Sabbath. Not because this was the only worship experience in town, as some think, and I've been taught coming up. It's because they followed Yeshua's and Paul's example of keeping the 4th commandment, the Sabbath, as scriptures state and Paul taught them. As Gentiles of Rome converted to the way, questions arose about the extent to which they should observe the Torah, including the Sabbath. In the Council of Jerusalem of 50 AD, the early church leaders decided that Gentile converts did not need to follow all the Torah. Instead, they were to abstain from certain practices. Namely, they should abstain from food polluted by idols, sexual immorality, the meat of strangled animals, and blood. Some use Acts chapter 15, verses 19 and 20 as proof text that Sabbath observance was not explicitly required, but this is a gross misinterpretation of the text out of its context. I'll deal with this passage of scripture in another video at a later time. Over time, as paganism and tares crept into the faith, Sunday worship gained significance. And in 321 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine declared Sunday a day of rest, aligning with Christian practice. Some use 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 2 to support Sunday as the primary day of worship and rest, but again, a gross misinterpretation of the text out of its context. The shift away from Sabbath worship was driven by man and by theological, practical, and social, political factors. It's crystal clear to me that the earliest Gentile converts to the way observed the Sabbath. This obedience to the Father was exhibited when they attended Sabbath worship to hear scriptures and to learn about the faith. This practice is evident in the book of Acts and all throughout scriptures. By keeping the Sabbath, I am joining a rich tradition that includes early Gentile believers who dedicated this day to spiritual growth and community. By keeping the Sabbath, I and you not only honor Yahweh's commandments and follow Yeshua's example, but you and I also join a tradition that spans centuries and cultures. The Sabbath is a special day set apart for rest, reflection, and connection with our Creator Elohim. It offers a unique opportunity to pause from busyness of life and focus on what truly matters. I hope sharing my reasons for observing the Sabbath encourages you to consider how this practice might enrich your own spiritual journey. Whether you are seeking deeper faith, more meaningful rest, or stronger sense of community, the Sabbath offers a profound way to connect with Yahweh and follow in the footsteps of Yeshua. Thank you for watching. If this message has inspired you, please share it with your family and friends. Please leave your comments below and share with us what led you to start keeping the Sabbath. Please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and and like or follow Saving Grace Torah Ministries on Facebook, Instagram, X, and TikTok. Peace, blessings, and joy from Dr. Christopher Rogers.